Hi, I'm Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, forthcoming next year from Zero Books. And today I'd like to talk about the intellectual dark web. You know who I'm talking about? Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Assorted Confederates. And I've been hearing a lot about these guys lately. In fact, it seems to me that everybody has been hearing a lot about them lately, which makes their branding a little strange, a little hard to understand. Because my understanding is that the actual dark web is about sketchy, illegal stuff that doesn't show up in Google searches. And not only do these guys show up in Google searches, they all seem to go on TV all the time and get loving profiles in the New York Times and swim around in pools of Patreon money like Scrooge McDuck. And so it seems like a little much for them to complain about being silenced. That, oh, if that's what being silenced by mobs of SJWs looks like, sign me up. Okay, but I don't want to be too hard on these guys, because there's at least a lot of what they say they stand for that I'm perfectly happy to sign on to. If all the rhetoric about these guys being renegades and heretics means anything at all, it's that they're all about fearlessly debating dangerous ideas and seeing where arguments lead no matter where that is. And hey, I love that stuff. I teach philosophy for a living. That means, among other things, I teach logic classes, both formal, symbolic logic, and the kind of class where you learn about informal logical fallacies. My doctoral dissertation was about issues in logic. I love all of that shit. So, given that, like me, they're all about just debating ideas and seeing where they go and not being afraid of arguments, that if somebody presents an argument for an idea that seems shocking or subversive to you, you carefully look at it, you see if you can find any flaws. If the argument is convincing, you change your mind. Great stuff. So given that this is the way that they brand themselves, and given their politics, you would expect them to be constantly critiquing Marxism. Because look, I obviously am on the other end of the spectrum from these fellows. Ben Shapiro is a self-identified proud conservative. Most of the rest, as far as I can tell, claim to be classical liberals, which seems to be a pretty common thing these days for right-wing intellectuals to say they are. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And I'm a socialist. I'm not just a everybody should have healthcare socialist. I'm a full-on workers' control of the means of production Marxist socialist. And so I would expect that these intellectual dark web guys would constantly be throwing interesting critiques at these ideas that I care about that would really be challenging me, would make me rethink my perspective. But not so much. In practice, generally speaking, when any of these guys are actually asked to say something about Marxism, well, it goes a little something like this.
Also, if you have the time, would you be willing to sign my copy of the Communist Manifesto so I can send some very interesting messages back at home?
Yeah, I mean, you can bring it right here and I'll sign it for you real fast. I will make you read the inscription out loud now.
This book sucks, by Ben Shapiro.
Now, when Shapiro can be bothered to work out more of an argument than this book sucks, it tends to take the form of a recitation of Stalinist atrocities. For example,
Karl Marx's idiotic philosophy led to the deaths of well over 100 million people during the 20th century alone.
When Jordan Peterson was challenged to a debate by Richard Wolff, an internationally famous and well-regarded Marxist economist, he also does a podcast I would strongly recommend called Economic Update with Richard Wolff, and he is the founder of a nonprofit called Democracy at Work, which promotes workers' cooperatives as an alternative to traditional capitalist businesses. When Richard Wolff offered to debate Jordan Peterson, well, Peterson responded pretty much the way that Ben Shapiro critiqued Marxism in the clip that we just watched.
You know, there's this professor, I think his name is Wolff. He put a challenge up on YouTube to me a couple of weeks ago to debate him. And what did he say? He said, he criticized my criticism of Marx. He said, well, that Peterson, you know, he's basically stuck in 1989. It's like, we've progressed way past the time of the Stalinists. It's like, and I thought, well, how about if a Nazi said that, just out of curiosity? It's like, well, it's not 1945, you know, anymore. It's like us National Socialists, we've progressed way past what happened in Nazi Germany. It's like, we should just, don't be stuck in the past, right? It's time to give us another chance. It's like, well, how about no? How about, well, we have the Soviet Union with the 20 million dead there, and we have Mao's China with God only knows how many people were killed there, and we have Cambodia, we have Vietnam. And
Jordan Peterson, for all his erudition and all his emotional intensity, is a very unserious person when it comes to getting basic facts right. This can be hilarious sometimes. When you see people in YouTube comments, for example, saying that, oh, you're just nitpicking if you object to Peterson saying that the last common ancestor of human beings and lobsters was 350 million years ago and really was more like 700 million years ago. What's a few 100 million years one way or the other? That's nitpicking, right? So Peterson is not very good with basic facts, and that comes out in this clip. He casually lumps together Cambodia and Vietnam as sites of communist atrocities, even though, if you know a little history, you know that communist Vietnam actually invaded Cambodia to try to stop Pol Pot's killing fields, and that the United States backed the Khmer Rouge against the Vietnamese-backed alternative Cambodian government. And I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory here. I'm talking about UN votes. Look it up. It gets even worse later in the video, when Peterson talks about Venezuela as an example of, you know, Marxism or socialism gone wrong, which, just to kill this once and for all, if you actually look up the numbers on the degree of state ownership in the Venezuelan economy, never mind now, post all the austerity, even in 2012, at the height of Chavez's welfare state, the percentage of Venezuelans employed by the public sector was smaller than the percentage of French people employed by the French private sector. If you don't think that France is a socialist country, you don't get to think that Venezuela is a socialist country. Full stop. That's just silly. Okay, so let's back up, though, from the details. Peterson is not a good details man, but fair enough. Not everybody's good at everything. Peterson's not good with facts. Let's just talk about the more general argument that Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson are making in these clips. And the most obvious way to read it is a kind of bad company argument. So obvious, because you're trying to figure out, okay, what is all this stuff about Stalin's Russia and Mao's China supposed to have to do with why Jordan Peterson won't debate Richard Wolff? Because Richard Wolff is clearly not the kind of Marxist or self-described Marxist who advocates single-party totalitarian dictatorships. I just said he was the founder of a nonprofit called Democracy at Work. Notice the word democracy in there. So you think, okay, so how is this recitation of the atrocities of Stalinism supposed to impact on how we should think about anti-Stalinist Marxists like Richard Wolff or Michael Harrington, who is a Marxist theoretician and the main founder of the Democratic Socialists of America? Again, note democratic in the name. Because these guys are clearly not Stalinists. They're clearly not advocates of a Soviet-style system. So what gives here? How do we read this argument? And the most obvious way to read it, as I just said, is as a bad company argument. As an argument that the reason that Marxism should be off the table for debate, they're dangerous heretics who are willing to debate just about anything, but not that, not Marxism, is because Marxism has been associated with these historical atrocities. There were dictators like Stalin and Mao who called themselves Marxists, and this association is enough to make Marxism totally illegitimate and not even worth considering or arguing about or debating. Okay, well, if that is their argument, there are two problems with that. First of all, if Marxism is vulnerable to bad company arguments, conservatism and classical liberalism are vulnerable to even stronger arguments along the same lines. So clearly we can't use bad company considerations to choose conservatism or classical liberalism over Marxism. After all, conservatives supported Pinochet in Chile. Conservatives supported the genocidal Suharto dictatorship in Indonesia. At least he's an anti-communist. The mainstream German Conservative Party put Hitler in power as part of a coalition government agreement. So if you want to find bad governments that were supported by or overseen by people who call themselves conservatives, there are no shortage. And when you talk about classical liberalism, even though I'm not sure how seriously to take some of these guys' pretensions to classical liberalism. These days, even Sargon of Akkad calls himself a classical liberal, so it doesn't mean much. If you do take it seriously, okay, that's an interesting comparison. Let's look at that. So, if Karl Marx is discredited by the actions of people who lived long after he died, then let's compare Karl Marx to comparable philosophical leading lights of classical liberalism, people like John Locke or John Stuart Mill. Well, John Locke was personally involved in the transatlantic slave trade. He not only had a financial stake there, he wrote extensive philosophical defenses of the morality of enslaving Africans. He was personally involved in drawing up the plans for the South Carolina colony. And again, he also extensively wrote philosophical defenses of the dispossession of the Native Americans. John Stuart Mill, admirable guy in many ways, but he was literally a colonial administrator for the British East India Company. Now, compare those careers to the career of Karl Marx. Karl Marx never advocated the kind of one-party totalitarian dictatorship that some people who called themselves Marxists instituted in the 20th century. In fact, he consistently defended press freedom. He was an opponent of the death penalty. The only revolutionary experiment that he endorsed was the Paris Commune of 1871, which was so radically democratic that even the anarchists in the First International, like Bakunin, also saw it as a model for a post-capitalist transitional kind of society. In fact, the only head of state that Karl Marx ever liked enough to even send the guy a friendly letter was not only not an unelected dictator, it was Abraham Lincoln, who Marx sent a congratulatory telegram to him after he was reelected president, because, of course, Marx was strongly motivated by opposition to slavery. So it seems to me that if the actions of later people who claim to be inspired by Marx invalidate Marx's ideas, then gosh, shouldn't the actual world historic atrocities participated in by people like John Locke and John Stuart Mill invalidate their ideas? Okay, so that's one problem. That if we're going to play the bad company game, we can play that in any number of directions. Another more serious problem is that bad company arguments are bad arguments. This is a logical fallacy. This is the association fallacy. Because, of course, just because some bad people say they endorse an idea, that tells you absolutely nothing about the idea itself or any arguments that have been made for it. You have to evaluate these things independently. Okay. So, if we interpret Shapiro and Peterson's argument in the obvious way as a bad company argument, that's just not a good argument. That's just not a serious contribution to any kind of discussion. But maybe we're not being charitable enough. So let's see if we can steelman Shapiro and Peterson's arguments. We can reinterpret them in some light that makes them stronger, more interesting, which is, of course, what you want to do. If you want to be a thinking person, as Peterson himself has said many times, you should try to be considering the strongest versions of your opponent's arguments. So, if it's not a bad company argument, what is it? Well, while we're thinking about that, let's think about another logical fallacy. This one is called the fallacy of equivocation. The fallacy of equivocation is committed in arguments like this one. So, premise 1, P1, only men are rational. P2, women are not men. Conclusion, women are not rational. All right. Now, given the views of some of these intellectual dark web guys on the ladies, some of them might get excited at this point, but of course this is a logically fallacious argument. On the face of it, it looks like it should actually be deductively valid. That if only people in category A have some trait and women don't fit into category A, then they don't have that trait. But the reason that it's not only not deductively valid, it's not a good argument in any way, is that there's a key term that's used in two different senses in two different parts of the argument, and the surface appearance that it's valid relies on that equivocation. All right, let's keep that in mind, that this is a really bad fallacy. We want to avoid it. You don't want to argue in ways that rely on those kinds of silly equivocations. And let's consider how we could possibly interpret the Shapiro-Peterson argument against Marxism. Well, one way to think about it is that it's not intended to be any sort of deductively valid argument. If you don't know this terminology, a deductively valid argument is an argument whose logical structure guarantees that if the premises are true, so are the conclusion. So is the conclusion. And you might think, okay, well, maybe this isn't supposed to be that kind of argument at all. Maybe it's only supposed to be a strong inductive argument. So an inductive argument is one where there's no logical guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. But there's a very good chance that the premises give you good, solid, serious reasons to believe the conclusion, even without that logical guarantee. And hey, most good arguments that we run into in most contexts in real life aren't of that kind, aren't deductively valid. Usually, if you can at least have an inductively strong argument, that's about the best we can hope for in this epistemic muddle that we're all trying to get through. So, fair enough. Maybe Shapiro and Peterson have a good anti-socialist inductive argument. So, what does that look like? It seems like it's going to be something like this, that say, oh, well, socialism has been tried many times before, and we've gotten gulags and bread lines and all these bad results. So what makes you think this time will be different? All right, so let's see if we can turn that into an explicit argument, and we can take a look at it. P1, socialism has been tried many times before. So we're talking Russia, China, Vietnam, etc. Premise 2, socialism has led to bad results in the past. Conclusion, socialism will lead to bad results if we try again. Okay, even with my terrible handwriting, that should be fairly clear. And it's not that if this P1 and P2 are true, the conclusion has to be true. Again, it's not deductively valid, but it's not intended to be. It's an inductive argument. That's perfectly fine. Here's what's not fine. That this argument commits the fallacy of equivocation. That socialism, in the first premise and in the second premise, refers to a system of one-party totalitarian dictatorship with the economy being planned from the top down by state bureaucrats and workplaces being just as hierarchical as they are under capitalism. And socialism, in the conclusion, means the kind of socialism that Richard Wolff advocates, the kind of socialism that Michael Harrington advocates, the kind of socialism that Marx and Engels and Rosa Luxemburg advocate. And I just mentioned a diverse group of thinkers. They would disagree with each other on various details, but they all agree that the heart of socialism is the extension of democracy from politics to economics, that if it's not democratic, it's not socialist. All right, at this point, I can just see on the other end of the screen there, some of you are itching to say, no, you're committing a logical fallacy yourself. What you're doing here is running a no true Scotsman argument. So the no true Scotsman argument is the kind of argument that we're running if you say that, for example, no Scotsman has ever fought with a wolf on the grounds of Springfield Elementary School, and I say, hold on, I saw groundskeeper Willie fight with a wolf on the grounds of Springfield Elementary just last week, and you say, no. If he did that, groundskeeper Willie is no true Scotsman.
Hey, Wolfie, put down that hors d'oeuvre. It's time for the main course.
Well, the no true Scotsman fallacy is committed when you shift the goalposts, that you change the definition in order to get around an objection. And it strikes me that the dynamic here is actually the opposite of that. That historically, before the rise of Stalinism, everybody used the word socialism to mean economic democracy. So the people who are saying that the USSR, for example, should be regarded as socialism are actually the people who are changing the definition of the term. And as such, saying this is no true Scotsman is like saying that democratic dissidents in North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, are no true Scotsmen when they say that North Korea doesn't count as a democracy. Or that, for that matter, I'm no true Scotsman if I say that somebody who was born in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia isn't a Scotsman, since, after all, the name means no Scotland. It has Scotland right in its name. Okay, but let's say for the sake of argument I'm wrong about all that. Let's say that whatever the right way to think of the word socialism is, the right definition of socialism is one that's so broad, it's so all-encompassing, that it includes both the economic democracy advocated by a Rosa Luxemburg who wanted democratic economic planning, or a Richard Wolff who might think that, well, some things should be nationalized, but there should be a market sector of competing workers' cooperatives. It's so broad that it includes those visions, and it also includes Stalinism. Or hell, let's say for the sake of argument that socialism should be defined in a way that only applies to Stalinism, that economic democracy doesn't even count. Well, if so, that's still an equivocation, because in the premises, socialism is being used in the correct way, and in the conclusion, at least to the extent that this argument is being directed against democratic Marxists like Richard Wolff, the word socialism is being used to describe economic democracy. One way or the other, there's still a fallacy of equivocation going on there. But let's go with the option I mentioned a minute ago. Let's say that the correct way to analyze the concept of socialism is so all-encompassing. It includes economic democracy. It also includes Stalinism. These are both just forms of socialism. Like, even if you say that, this is still an equivocation. Because even if we say, okay, economic democracy is socialism sub 1, Stalinism is socialism sub 2, well, all of your considerations about the history of bread lines and gulags are about socialism sub 2, and you're trying to use these as evidence for a conclusion about socialism sub 1. So, not a good argument. Or maybe not. Maybe I'm being too quick here. Maybe there's some consideration that a Shapiro or a Peterson could trot out here that would really make me rethink this. Maybe they say, well, okay, granted, socialism sub 1 and socialism sub 2 are two very different ideas, but maybe there's some reason, and Peterson has made not very well fleshed out remarks in the past that sort of gesture in the direction of this argument that socialism sub 1 would inevitably turn into socialism sub 2. Maybe the problems with socialism sub 2 aren't specifically with the totalitarian one-party political arrangement or the bureaucratic form of economic organization. Maybe they'll go deeper than that. Maybe any form of non-capitalist economics is going to lead to the same problems, perhaps because of some form of the calculation problem pushed by people like Hayek and von Mises. Maybe that's ultimately what they have in mind. If so, though, those are complicated ideas. Those are tricky to sort out. There's a lot you can say on both sides of them, and all of that would be said in the context of an actual debate. Oh, hold on. Looks like somebody has a question.
Dr. Burgis, will you sign my 12 rules for life?
Oh, certainly. All right. Now, I am going to have to do like Ben Shapiro did in the clip we saw earlier and ask you to read off what I wrote there.
If this guy was confident about his ideas, he would debate Richard Wolff.
Yes, he would.